So I'm gonna just read. I guess what I'm gonna do is talk about what I meant or how I happened to write the things I wrote, and read little bits and pieces of them. I'm gonna read from the Iceland book and Inferno. So I kind of always imagined, Inferno came out last year, and the year before Iceland came out. So I thought there would be a moment when both of them were out, and it would be like the Fire and Ice moment. So I guess this is the beginning of the Fire and Ice tour. So thanks. But I have kind of a playlist, and so I'll start with Iceland. And it's kind of a funny. It's a book that just sort of happened, and I just let happen in a way, because I'm a poet, and I am very purposefully that. And I came to New York in the 70s and was sort of told by older poets that in order to not be a drug addict, I should write about art, because that was sort of one of the only other career avenues one could take. And I didn't want to write about art at all, and sort of resisted it for a very long time. And then someplace in my 30s, I thought, what a great idea, and began to do it. But I feel like being a poet in the art world is just like being a person in a building, and just taking on, I guess, the position of what it feels like to be moving through these spaces, and having, one of my favorite words that I picked up from Roland Barthes is co-anesthetic, which is about the whole world of sounds before we really learn language. And I think they really have to do with, we all know that thing about what happens when babies aren't held in orphanages, but apparently there's another part to that, which is sonic, which is that infants have a very strong response to the sounds of familiar voices coming closer and closer to them, and the rhythms of those voices. And you can actually fuck a baby up by being its mother and talking in a different rhythm. The baby won't know who you are, apparently. And people have done all these interesting tests with kids from a whole variety of cultural backgrounds, and getting them each to sit down. It's a little bit like the classic ESP test, but instead of secretly holding waves and circles, you just say, and ask them what that means. And it's really interesting that on that level of that co-anesthetic level of being a body in relationship to sounds and spaces, people kind of always across cultures get those sounds. They're pretty. So there's a kind of an animality, I think, to being a writer in the art world, and thinking about what it is to not so much to make this stuff, but make statements about it, and feel your way around it in language. So I want to read first a piece that is kind of a Valentine to Stuart, because we met about 10 years ago when he threw together this temporary kind of artist colony in Pennsylvania when he was curating art at Bucknell College's gallery. So I was one of the artists who came there, and it was very strange, because I thought, okay, everybody's doing like these installations in like fields and forests, and I'm a poet. What am I going to do? I'm going to walk around and look at everybody else. And eventually, I kind of spewed a poem the last night, and it felt great. I thought, oh, I've made a tiny thing. This is so perfect. But there were other strange outcomes to that residency. One being that I don't want to ruin my own piece, but I was roommates with an artist there, and who made an amazing piece. And then a few years later, I wound up being a professor at the University of California in San Diego for a few years. And so then that artist did a presentation of his work, which was a film, and the film was of the performance that he had done that summer when we were in a residency together. And so then when I was working on this book, I thought I have to write about that piece. And so that's what this is. And it's called What I Saw. Part of the sonic experience of this is hearing me flip pages, and I'll do it closer to the microphone so that you can have the joy too. I think one of the reasons William Pope L's A Negro Sleeps Beneath the Susquehanna is, in my opinion, the finest piece of performance art I've ever seen, is that by its end, it existed in its own category, one of sublime artifice, practically religious art. Because all the elements were carefully chosen and exquisitely played, and then he left us. The end of the piece didn't exist, so it had almost like a religious note, certainly musical. Well, let me back up. The piece took place in the context of a residency. Maybe that's important too. To perform in a residency is a thing in itself. A group of us had been invited to spend 2 weeks in residence at Cowan, a leafy park-like place, used for conferences and stuff, and it was close to a part of the campus of Bucknell, which is in way southern Pennsylvania, an Amish country. So the land is yellow and green and rolling. Farm country, and it's not far from Gettysburg, the site of one of the worst battles of the Civil War. The idea was for each of us to create a piece during our residency and show it at the end. People were living on the site of the conference center mostly, which meant they sort of lived in barracks and never really got away from each other. I know we ate, but I don't remember how meals occurred. There were these sort of dining rooms in the barracks. William and I lived in the poet's house, much nearer the Bucknell campus. I think because he was working on a novel and I was writing there too. So there was a sense that we needed workspace rather than the great outdoors like the sculptors and photographers. And there was a great reversal from most artist colonies where writers get like a little ledge to work on, and writers always work in their bedrooms, and sculptors and painters and composers get big studios by the sea or something. Here the writers got a house and it was great. But I had no idea what William was working on. I think he was making paintings in the basement, and I don't remember ever seeing them, or maybe I did. I think they were abstract paintings. On presentation day, when people's spouses came, and so did the public, and obviously whoever was paying for our residencies, one went to see Carol Hepper's artificial tree installed in the middle of the land, and Paola, in a pale pink dress, leaped out from behind trees in a riveting and esoteric fashion. Barbara Pollock's fuzzy Polaroids. Then I feel we went away before we came back for William. We knew he was doing a performance. There was a sound of an engine of some sort over by the river, and this was actually the first time I knew there was a river there. I guess I hadn't been so interested in the land. When we got closer, we saw that it was William lying down with his face in a mound of flour, white flour, breathing into it, and just by existing, making his face not so much white as not so black, but powdered looking. I was impressed at this point by his comfort in getting down into it, a willing abasement. The breathing went on for a while, and then he got up. He was now sitting up at the table and began speaking into the microphone instead of breathing into it. I remember that he kept uttering the word crab. That his language felt broken even when it was whole. Wish I could dream. That was something he said again. It was like entirely subjunctive speech. It was his, but it was like he was saying it. It was like he was saying it for him. He was carrying it for himself. That his capacity to speak seemed central to the nature of the piece. That the words could be forced to come if he and we were patient enough to wait for them. I just saw a musician perform like this the other night. The song was all broken. It was really painful, though constant. But he had us. I would love to read a novel William would write. After some reading, he put on some big boots, on tall rubber boots, or maybe he was already wearing them. He had some silly thing on his back, like a fanny pack, but it was a rubber one. He wore a jock. Everything he had seemed ready to float. In retrospect, his voice had been really loud when he was sitting at the table. It seemed to echo deeply. I think this was because the rest of the piece was silent, though I felt I could still hear it. It was quietly booming now. He seemed to look, kind of weaving around for some more things to use, to pick up, something to do, but he just wound up in the water and planted there were some pieces of mirror. A large rectangular piece that he had mounted on his back, and it had like lines, probably tape running across it, so it wasn't sheer, but mostly broken looking. And he started walking down the river. He was staggering. I never thought of it till now is like a crucifix, the burden of it, I mean. He was stumbling either from its weight or from the unevenness of the river's surface. But the mirror reflected the trees on either side of the river. It reflected the sky for a moment. It felt very emotional right away, like familiar, like you already knew it. I keep remembering as I write this that there was a full moon tonight in New York, a very special one, bigger than it will be for more than 2 years. I forgot to look. The mirror on William's back sometimes felt like he was carrying the river, that he was the river himself, that he was it. He seemed to vanish into everything there was, walking further and further away from us. The voice was gone, but you still felt it, and the breathing too. He could do this. The performance didn't so much end as leave us. It was an astonishing spectacle somehow, and I wound up feeling very sad. I thought about how Mark Twain stopped writing Huck Finn for 10 years because he didn't know what to do with Huck and Jim when they got to the river. The residents and the visitors were just sitting there. There was nothing to photograph anymore because he was gone. We kept looking down the river, but that was it. Maybe I'll read I'm going to read a little piece about, do you guys like poetry? Yes. Poetry? Okay. I was like, whoa. One of my favorite poets was a guy named James Schuyler, and he was sort of a nature poet, so it's a little piece about him. And then from there, I'm going to go to Bjork. Okay, so this one is called I, like this I, the poems of Jimmy Schuyler. James Jimmy Schuyler wrote with the green, loving eye of nature. He wrote a teeny bit like God for most of his life, though he was not a religious man, but his conscious appraisal of those sentiments were there from his earliest career, and by the end of his life, as he approached death, he felt on the spot, and something like God was very much in the poems. I feel like I've been invited to talk about Jimmy's nature poems. With that in mind, I found myself continually circling around the way Jimmy thought, because that's what seems most like nature in this man. The structure of his weaving and making and being the poems always seems like their real natural end. It's easy to start with one of his most anthologized poems, and one that only gets better with the reading. It's got a trick, and it works, but its very subject, intention, nature, and memory become more profoundly realized with each rereading. Salute. Past is past, and if one remembers what one meant to do and never did, is not to have thought to do enough? Like that gathering of one of each I planned to gather one of each kind of clover, daisy, paintbrush that grew in that field the cabin stood in, and studied them one afternoon before they wilted. Past is past. I salute that various field. The poem is not an act of sentimentality. The sentimental thing would be to have done it, the gathering of flowers, and be remembering that in the poem. Instead, the line, yet if one remembers what one meant to do and never did, courts an aching abyss of human loss, perhaps a slight one about merely gathering flowers, but nonetheless an acknowledgement of failure. It didn't happen. But bravely, the poet persists. Is not to have thought to do enough? Could that possibly be true? It's a thought that seems more impossible daily in a world where being, never mind being in a thought, hardly has a place. But let's look at what he would have done, our oddly stoic, aching human. Like that gathering of one of each, I planned to gather one of each kind of clover, daisy, paintbrush. It has the air of some kind of rainbow gathering of flowers, and the book it's from, Freely Espousing, was published in 1969, the same year as Woodstock. There's a slightly millenarian and weirdly precise mathematical impulse afoot in the poem, to gather one of each kind of clover, daisy, paintbrush. The guy does seem to think he's God, because aren't there invariably always more sorts of things, more things in nature than we know? Wouldn't his task never end in some way? It's a bit of a creation myth, I think, and it gets fiercer. He hoped to gather the flowers that grew in that field the cabin stood in and study them one afternoon before they wilted. Again, weird, rapacious. To study the flowers? What the hell does that mean? The impulse seems scientific and steeped in the awareness of the flower's doom, period. So he's a bit of a creepy scientist, an overly dark one to boot. Can I say it too many times? A weirdo. What does this poem of Schuyler's and a few others, why does this poem of Schuyler's and a few others seem more schematic than natural? To me, it's more of a theorem than an idyll. So why does it live? Let's read it again. Past is past, and if one remembers what one meant to do and never did, is not to have thought to do enough? Like that gathering of one of each I planned, to gather one of each kind of clover, daisy, paintbrush that grew in the field the cabin stood in, and studied them one afternoon before they wilted. Past is past, I salute that various field. Look at that past is past at the beginning and nearly the end, creating sort of a marred palindrome effect. The tone of past is past is both Gertrude Stein and Mom. I didn't do it, the doleful kid wails. Past is past, she huffed it back at him, her hands in the sink. If one remembers begins to sound beautiful, it's a narrator of this little movie, the way all the little repetitions in the poem, like that gathering of one of each I planned to gather one of each kind of clover, daisy, paintbrush, performs like a wrinkle in time. A children's rhyme said again and again, one meant to do everything to save all of beauty one afternoon. If one remembers that one meant to do that, to hold everything, that does sound like enough. Salute is a very late 20th century kind of poem. You simply can't hold it, but know that you would. And right now, today, I, the poet, salute that incredible, impossible feeling, and somehow by recording my desire, I've succeeded. I hope you guys don't feel totally manipulated, like every time I stop, you feel like you have to applaud. I hope it's a real, because otherwise I'll be like, I don't know, the jerk up here. Like, now applaud, I'm silent again. And I was like, it's sort of weird. I love reading this piece because you just keep reading the same poem again and again, but you also feel like sort of a weird English teacher. Like, it's like, listen to the poem, everybody. So it's only that I love the poem so much that I kind of get lost in the sentiment anyhow. So here's a little Bjork. How are we doing? I mean, one of the experiences I've had as a person who, besides writing poems, writes, about art and things in the world, is the biggest problem always is like the pitch. Like, you have a great idea, you're like, oh my God, this is so incredible. And then you run to all the magazines and journals you have a relationship with, and you're like, da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da, and they're like, no. And then you go to somebody else and you're like, da-da-da-da-da-da-da, and you're like, no. And it's just like this attrition thing where your excited idea keeps getting smaller and smaller and smaller. And at first it's like you have a great idea, you're really excited about writing it, and you want to get paid, and you want everybody to read it. And then you're like, you have a really great idea, you want somebody to read it, you want people to see it, and you wouldn't mind getting a little money. Then it's like, you have a really great idea, and it goes on to get smaller and smaller. And the worst thing that happens is you just don't write the piece at all. And I've like wasted some of my really best ideas in that approach, because the jerky thing about being a journalist is that you really, unlike, say, poets, you really actually you expect to get paid for your thoughts, you know? And so when they kind of pull the wallet away from you and you're like the jerk on the sidewalk reaching, you just kind of collapse. Whereas a poet sort of starts off kind of melancholy and you just keep writing because nobody wants it. And then you're surprised when they do, so it's like this reversal. So it's sort of like a lot of what happened, this book, you know, I wrote this book over like 20 years of having all these different experiences with great ideas. But what happens occasionally is you just meet there was a magazine for a while, Index magazine was one of those great magazines that paid you nothing, usually nothing, or just the most little, like $50 or something, but whatever you came in with, they were like, great, we love that. Well, you give that to us tomorrow. We're going to press tonight. So they would let me, so I would be like, I've got a great idea. I want to fly to Colorado at my own expense to see Bjork and write about it. And they were like, yeah, you know, here's $50, you know. But I did it, so this is that piece. It's kind of like being a poor man's rock journalist. And the only thing, the happy sign at the end of the road is when somebody says, we'll do a book of all your pieces. And so then it gets all back put together again. And it looks like you've had this amazing life as a journalist, when instead you just had this most racked up credit card, you know, of, well, not probably the same as all your friends, more or less, but on the road with Bjork. No matter what, I rarely travel calm. This time I even got in an accident the night before. I was meeting my friend Taylor in Ocean Beach. We're in San Diego right now. In Ocean Beach, and after we shook hands and hugged the night before he was going off to college, Berkeley, we jumped into our vehicles and drove off. Like any accident, I can remember all the choices. Should I take the 5 or the 8? Should I turn left on Cable or go straight to Sunset Highway and then turn left? All my choices brought me to 8 when it merged. One lane dropped out, and suddenly all the cars in front of me stopped, and I slammed on my brakes, which are not so good, and I did not slam into the car in front, but in a moment the car behind me did. Wham! It was a big one. I pulled over to see how the other guy was, who went shooting to my left on the ascending shoulder, fortunately not going over. It's you! It was Taylor gaping at me. I was hit by a friend. It felt like good luck, not bad, certainly that we were okay, but even more that we chose to have an accident together. I'm still awaiting the significance of this incident. I was heading to Bjork's concert at Red Rocks in August. I managed to get my accident-jarred body into the right plane, and then I took a shuttle from Denver to Boulder. We stopped at a bland condominium development in Westminster, where a really nice lady was visiting her son, a college student that she had bought the condo for. She loved everything around us. The mall, the climate in Colorado as opposed to Houston. My trip had begun. Once alone with the driver, I engaged him. I'm not a student, he told me. I throw clay. Turns out he's a drummer as well, and the two practices are similar. Your fingers are feeling the turning pot, awaiting through a series of taps exactly what the pot would like you to do. Yes, everyone says that, I replied. It moved me. I arrived in Boulder and it was raining. Brian was standing in front of the door of his leafy cottage, and inside I met Chris, Brian's boyfriend, and Emily, and Emile, who had driven from LA, and Leanne, who's South African and a muted activist, because these days that can get you deported. In the parking lot at Red Rocks, Chris explained how Matmos, who are fags and are on stage with Bjork and produced her last 2 records, does analog, not digital. Analog is filling spaces, kind of patching things in. And digital, Chris explained, one actually composes into something. Something moving, turning, he said. God, I thought, like the pot. Amra's here with Pigpen. Amra's how I knew about the concert in the first place. She lives in LA. We all have cell phones. I know where their seats are. Coming up the steps, we get frisked. You can't even bring in a camera, and now they're looking at my cell phone to make sure that's not a camera either. You can totally date the story from the technology. It's so weird. Like, who would have a cell phone that wasn't a camera now? That's like crazy. My truck's fucked. I can get a picture of that for this piece. We arrived in our row in the cavernous WPA amphitheater. It's like a huge bowl of red stone, and the audience, about 3,000, has been screaming sporadically during our entire walk-in. Every time someone comes out to lift a wire, they howl. It's an incredible show. There's Mars, says Brian. A tiny red dot is hovering to the right. It won't be that close for 60,000 years. We won't see it again. He looks at me. I love to dwell in almost infinitely gross understatement. We feel good. I step down to row 28 and there's Amra and Pigpen. Is the journey complete? Nobody even wanted to go on this trip a few days ago, but we're here. I was in an accident, I say. Amra goes, no. She grew up in California. She has like movie star reactions to everything. But I'm okay, she sighs, smiles quietly. Pigpen just grins. Pigpen's a new surfer who also builds movie sets. She's a dude. I love Pigpen. I feel like he's my bro. We all stand there knowing this is our moment for communing. Isn't it great, says Amra. Incredible, I reply. Then we have some version of the WPA conversation about the America that was getting built for a while. Why can't we have it now? There are so many artists, so many people out of work. I'm thinking you could just pay people to travel to concerts. Migrant audience workers. We talk about the blackout. That's FDR too. Power companies were screwing people at the beginning of the century. FDR stopped it. We're just happy to be together, examining everybody's clothes, the hundreds and thousands of people who came here too. Another scream, because now the Icelandic string quartet is taking the stage, and Matmos too, over there on the right. I think I've got to go. We all kiss. Amra glows. Pigpen has a stare and a grin. I always feel like we both know something. We do. Yeah, says Brian when I sit back down. This is so exciting. Chris leans forward and smiles at me. Before music, with many people, you feel a collective hush, even if it's loud. Bjork steps out, and I'm trying to see the new hairdo, and soon the giant screen is on. It's like a slanted bowl. She's got a big white wrap, like a bunny fur, tossed over her left shoulder, a black velvety dress, short, black stockings, maybe orange shoes. She feels like a baby tyrant, very formal. The circle of Icelandic musicians lift their bows. Matmo starts leaning, pulling, plugs, and being, making it happen. They look like a cooking show. On the far left is this harpist I heard about. Who could it be but Zena Parkins? It is. We know all the songs, but it's grand, like little pieces from a million operas. That poet word, shard. Shards of songs, and another screen has fish floating by and pieces of arms. Weird, but good. Art wallpaper. Bjork leans forward with the mic, all gallant. She steps back and dances around, skips. She works the lip and the audience screams, running close to the lip of the stage, claiming it and making it come alive. Zena's jumping up and down when she doesn't play. Matmos never stops except when it's all acoustic and the Icelandic string band soars. Mars winks. Behind Bjork, jets of flame spout out into the air and later twirling crinkles of light like wire sculpture. Corny, but great. There's a music video to her left, all feathers. It looks like the meeting of Bjork and Matthew Barney. Romantic, and I'm emoting for them. There's a welling inside the Mountain Opera House. We're in that feeling of excess and civilization and social power and fashion, because this audience is full of very good clothes. Rough but bright. There's a collective sensation of sitting in the right culture tonight. God, it feels good. Bjork says thank you again and again, very polite. She's our star and she's nice. Shit, we really should have tried to get backstage. Brian and Chris interviewed Matmos. We have their cell number. Should we call? I'm thinking I know Matthew, and I really know his mother, Marsha Barney. God, look at Zena. That's so great. Bjork feels like Mary Gateskill and Holly Hughes, both baby giants. Is Bjork small? It's the lightness somehow, a compact vision that takes everything on. Yeah, she feels like a poet. I have an Icelandic friend, Christine Oma's daughter. She probably knows Bjork. After the stage goes dark, it looks like there's not going to be an encore. How could that be? Our waiting period is long. She looked a little tired. It's strange to be so far away and yet close. Walter Benjamin, yep, he said it all. This show is Bjork, but it's all about us. We love her for giving us this. She was a child star, Brian tells me. She'll always be our baby. It was miserable pulling out of the parking lot. Not that bad. All I could think of was leaving the drive-in with my parents. We got lost on the way home, and then in Brian and Chris's kitchen, we ate everything in sight. Amra and Piggy are probably home by now. In the morning, I was walking very slowly along the Boulder Creek, thinking I'd probably catch a shuttle at the Boulderado, da-da-da-da-da. And then I glance at my watch, I do the math, and suddenly I'm running down the path, cutting around corners down Canyon Street, Spruce, and I missed it. Next, I'm in a very expensive cab with Nate, and he wants to teach English and travel around the world. On both sides of me, I see mountains and hills. I love this land. I'm going to cut away to fire, and then me and Stuart are going to talk. Actually, the aftermath of that was horrible because Matt and us were actually pissed that we didn't come backstage, and we were like humiliated then and like sort of degraded by our own shyness. So it was sort of like there was like a dark corridor after this event. I think everybody's okay now. Let's see. So this book is called Inferno, a poet's novel, and what it is you know, I'm a poet, and it's a novel. It's like that's the story. Well, I've written several other novels or fictions, which have a main character with the name Eileen Myles, and I think in the course of publishing them, publishers would say, because I wasn't like, they were like, who is she? Because if you weren't like the little girl who fell down a well when she was 3 and now she's like 40 or 50 or 60, it's sort of like, why would we want to hear every detail of her life up until there? So I was like, how can I market my life then if they don't know who I am? So I thought, oh, if I write a book about being the poet Eileen Myles, then when they say, who is she? They can say, she's the poet Eileen Myles, and it's that book. But oddly, then by the time my agent went out with this book, they didn't ask that question. They asked some other question, so it didn't seem to matter. But nonetheless, I wrote an entire book about my career as a poet. But so there's one part that was just specifically about the relationship of poetry to the art world, and I'm going to read that part, and then I'll sit in the silence with you guys for a while, unless you applaud wildly. So at this point in the poet's life, see, actually it's so weird, the very grant that I did today is a grant that asks that you write a career narrative. And of course, every time you come up and you're like, how do, like it's just, for any artist, but I think particularly for a poet, you're like, what am I going to tell them? And you can't ever tell them your real life story or how you actually made a living because it's too abject or unbelievable. And so what I did when I wrote, so I followed Dante's Inferno, and I did do Hell, which is basically coming to New York in the 70s as a female poet. That was Hell, and then Heaven was how to write a poem and also how to become a lesbian, and so that's the middle section or the last section of the book. But Purgatory is the career of the poet, and so what I did was I decided to do that grant application straight up and tell the real career narrative. So in that narrative, the poet is in fact supported by a couple of rich painters who decide that she's like their pet poet. And there was a summer in which the poet the poet had a book to finish, and she applied to 4 artist colonies, and none of them accepted her, and it was just like, oh my God. And meanwhile, she was going off to do a studio visit with the wife who was a woman who was a painter, but she was married to a very famous painter. And so the poet was going to visit this woman's studio, feeling really abject and thinking, I'm going to go visit her studio, and meanwhile I'm just, like in hell. And so she visited this person. The person said, what are you doing this summer? She said, I don't know, because I just got rejected by all these artist colonies. And the artist said, well, we just have a little house in the country. Maybe you'd like to use that to work in. Maybe you'd like to go for a drive and see it. And it turned out to be like a 70-acre estate. So the poet stayed for a few months in this amazing estate and wrote there. And so this is who these two people are. They're fictionalized. So at this point in time, this is such a long explanation. At this point in time, the famous painter wife has been in the Whitney Biennial, which has everybody in New York going crazy. Like, how dare she, right? The art world was buzzing that year about the fact that Eden was in the Biennial. Cato was too, but he was every year. It didn't matter if Eden's paintings were any good. Her being in the show upset the order of things, and she was an artist wife and was supposed to stay that way. Eden knew all about class. I figured that's why she liked me. I mean, plus, you know, the fucking Biennial, what's that? One year it's a man, next year 2 women, somebody that likes painting or politics. I mean, the curators. Or suddenly it's the West Coast. What an amazing idea. I am so glad I'm not an artist. A poet kind of is, but really it's like you're a professionalized person. Poetry, nobody knows what the fuck it is. And what makes it entirely odd is that there's no money in it. So in the awards department, it's worse than art. No poetry-driven economy, no critical machinery. There's just no thing at all, which could be Zen, but instead it's entirely the opposite. It's so symbolic and humorless. Awards are the only currency American writing culture has to describe a writer's work. It's almost French. But in France, at least, the ribbons mean something. You get dinner, a bottle of wine, people know you. Here, it's nothing. And like everything else horrible, eventually it leaches into the soil. Even Allen Ginsberg wanted an award. The week before he died, he emailed Bill Clinton to say, "I'm Allen Ginsberg, the poet. I've never received any kind of award from my country. It would be great if I could get something before I die." But if it would make difficulties for you with Gingrich and the right, I understand. Clinton didn't write back. Nothing for the man who wrote America? Allen knew it wasn't even remotely possible to get honored by the superpower that can't tolerate criticism of itself. But he was dying and he had to ask. Robert Lowell got honored, but he wasn't a queer or a Jew. He was Robert Lowell. I remember the year Lowell died, everyone writing these kiss-ass pieces in The Voice about his white hair blowing in the wind as he walked across Harvard Yard, which disgusted me. I wrote this. There are still people who are mad at me for it, people who went to Harvard or wished they did, pretty much. On the death of Robert Lowell. Oh, I don't give a shit. He was an old white-haired man, insensate beyond belief, and filled with much anxiety about his imagined pain. Not that I'd know. I hate fucking wasps. The guy was a loon, signed up for spring semester at McLean's, a really lush retreat among pines and hippie attendants. Ray Charles also once rested there. So did James Taylor. The famous, as we know, are nuts. Take Robert Lowell, the old white-haired coot. Fucking dead. I went to Ravenna to visit Dante's grave. I got a traveling grant for it. This older couple took my picture in front of Dante's big mound. It was a handsome flat stone surrounded by ivy. It would look great in the back of this book, blurbs streaming across the ivy. Ravenna was an ugly town, mall-like and depressing. I didn't want to stay there long, so I raced around to all the tiny chapels with the mosaics. I had an hour before they closed, so I gunned it in order to hover stilly for 10 minutes in the same alabaster light that Dante did. I imagined it the morose light of the Inferno. We craned our necks at the riverman with a walking stick who moved silently across the ceiling. He was God, but he seemed even older. It was a cartoon movie from a time when Christianity was so young, even God had friends and advisors. Later at the Hotel Byron, I sat up reading this battered copy of Seabiscuit I found in the lobby. I bought Seabiscuit thinking a horse book would be good on the plane, but I met this nice lady who wouldn't stop talking. I handed it to her. Really? Yeah, you'll love it. It's the compelling story of an unlikely horse and jockey who won a legendary race. In 1938, a legendary time. Before the war, and Seabiscuit takes you through the unique relationship of jockey and horse. There's also some nice historical stuff in it about Tijuana. Tijuana's heyday as a racing capital. Marilyn Monroe once bought a round for this whole bar on Avenida Revolucion to celebrate the end of her marriage. It was during the filming of The Misfits. I know the place. Wasn't The Misfits everyone's last movie? I imagine Marilyn walking in and buying a round. I could not put Seabiscuit down. Now when I go shopping, when I reach into the meat section, I think book, racehorse, and family-sized pack of ground beef. I look for the pack with the shiniest star and I grab it, because I don't know anything about meat. And luckily, cold dead mammals are always covered with medals and stamps. Definitely in the chain stores. In fact, if there's no stamp, you almost think the meat is bad, like Allen Ginsberg. I'm thinking about the reading experience. Why is it good that we read Seabiscuit so fast? If you read the reports before it was even published, you can hear the joy in the salesmen's voices. A lot of people are gonna like this book. The tone's all over the map. It's almost porn. Something a little bit dirty at so many points that it's kind of dirty for everyone. Yeah, that's American. Let's all swallow Seabiscuit together. That's it. Good, good, going down. And you feel just a little bit sick. And it's great, because it's about what losers we are, Americans. But we're gonna win, especially my parents' generation. They already won. They won a war. How can it get any better than that? My girlfriend and I were standing in our kitchen while I pondered the hopelessness of writing a book about a poet. Well, she tooted, have you ever considered the demographic you were writing for? Yes, I have, as a matter of fact. Well, I lowered her into a shallow grave. This proposal is a guidebook. It follows the utter singularity of my entire writing career, the shape my writing forces you through. I mean, for as long as I can remember, I've been trying to break into reality through this one idea, this medium, poetry. Yet where did I get the idea to write about myself, to use my own name? Is this natural? Will I talk about that idea? I may not have another opportunity in my life to do this, so yes, I will. Well, I got the idea from Truffaut, all those boy coming-of-age movies. Also, one day, walking through the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston with my family, we were heading to the Picasso. This guy with black hair was talking on a monitor about his life. It was like a diary. I was like, wait a second, that's TV, you can do that? Well, from then on, everything I will do will be that way, absolutely. And I began taping then. The marketing people will say, so who is she? Who is this, the author of this book, this lesbian no-one, that we should listen to all this crap about her development? She didn't win anything, right? Okay, did anything horrible happen to her? No, I mean, yes, but that's not what she's writing about here. Maybe it wasn't that bad. I love this book, the editor writes. We all love your book, but we can't get it past the marketing people because who are you? I mean, really? I'm the poet Eileen Myles. Why not? If a fucking horse can tell a story, why can't I? Well, okay, if you're going to take Eileen on, you're going to have to work very closely with her since it's the first novel. But I guess it is a very American idea. Even Eileen can write a novel. We'd like to prove that. We'd like to help. The horse gets jammed, legs waving, into the grinder, and now we're smoothing on the stamp. This meat is old. Let's run it through Photoshop and get it crisper version. Are you bored? That's what literature feels like, right? It's boring. It happened to us. After a while, you can't even see a distant tree. Eyesight atrophied. The poor little culture grew up too fast. I guess that's it. Thanks to all those nights in the 80s after the invention of the fax, when the business world stayed open all night long, buying and selling supermarkets and bookstores and planes, we, artists and writers, people in bands, were even the final executioners, sitting there, legal proofreading agreements all night for $30 an hour, a good gig. The selling of airlines, entertainment conglomerates, records and books and movies, DVDs, everything getting consolidated around the world into one long, undifferentiated meal. Sip what astronauts suck from tubes. Each substance clearly labeled for the journey. Poetry, music, art, it's all there. Spin the dial. I can't find that track. Will you send it to me? Oh, I do? I have it? You're right, it is there, but now I can't open it. I'm trying. It feels like we are missing something, a layer. Well, maybe 2 or 20 got washed away by the storm, quietly removed, scrape, scrape, or plunk, dropped in the trash. In the past 20 years or 40 years, not much public thinking going on in this country. Watch out, world. Outside the academy, itself a very expensive and disconnected finishing school for artists who indenture the next 10 years of their lives, gambling on the prospect of their art career, paying out, getting a gallery, selling a book so they don't have to sit with a bunch of losers, wasting time, sleepless, working millions of hours a week to pay rent here in New York, especially during their highly marketable youth, while the government, Leviathan, fartingly collapses into the vulnerable context of its own stupidity, the poor, suffering world. Thank you. Thank you.
That is very hard to follow.
We'll just be next to to it. We won't follow.
Okay, we won't try to follow it. Okay, I want to just ask, I guess, one question and then let people who come ask questions. But I know one of the things that I didn't read in the intro to you is that you've spent a lot of time of late, not right now, teaching writing. Mm-hmm. And so one of the things I'm interested in is, how do you teach writing? Like, what are the issues that you find when you were doing this work in California? Mm-hmm. Like either prose or poetry or whatever you might have been dealing with students. What do they want to know most? What are the issues you think are actually teachable? I mean, and we've talked mm-hmm. before in just our friendship together about what one might learn from predecessors. So like, you know, you read about mm-hmm. Jimmy Schuyler and so there's a kind of, I'm kind of coming at it from the two ways. Like, what do you learn from elders, and then how do you deal with youngsters?
Right. Well, I think there's like multiple kinds of youngsters in the same way that there's multiple kinds of elders. And so the first thing I think when somebody says, what do they want to know? Everybody wants to know how you sell a book, how you get an agent, how you get a big publisher. I mean, everybody, you know, we're all like economically challenged. So at every moment, people are thinking, how do I hit it? You know, so that's that. But within the world of people who are actually interested in writing, it's sort of like, it's just like everything. I mean, like writing, the first time I ever got a job teaching writing, the person who interviewed me said, what would you do with a student who really couldn't write? How would you discourage them? You know? And I felt like my answer was like, you don't have to bother. Most people stop. You know, it's sort of like, the thing that's so weird about art and writing is that I think talent is so vastly common. I mean, the most beautiful thing I've learned from teaching writing is that everybody can write. And I really mean, I mean everybody. I've had workshops where there was one person that people were like, oh, you know, like nobody could bear this person's poems. And eventually in 14 weeks, they kicked out an amazing poem at least once. You know, and would they do it again? That's another question. You know, would they do it again on and on and on and become a writer is another question. But it's sort of like the capacity to become a writer, to write beautiful things, and to kind of like do it in some amazing way is very, very common. But I think the thing that's interesting is that most people don't keep doing it because of the difficulty, and also, you know, to keep doing anything is hard. Right? It's sort of like, and so you have to have this incredible desire, you know, and so the thing that's interesting about teaching is learning how to speak to the people who have desire, and you don't know which people they are. I mean, I think one of the weirdest things about teaching is that you're in this position like that I'm in right now, which is you're yak, and people are sitting in front of you, and there's all these different faces, and especially when you first begin to teach, you don't know what's going on because people's social faces and what's going on inside of them are radically. It's sort of like a Nathaniel Hawthorne story or something. It's sort of like we have these crazy masks, like the most judgmental, mean blonde girl would be having the most sensitive, amazing thoughts. You know, it's sort of like everybody is full of surprises and part of it being that we've all been socialized to hide our feelings and to create this sort of social mask in the educational process. And so the thing is, you're kind of in this amazing crapshoot when you teach, saying these things that, you're either feeling elated or depressed as hell in a given day, and you're just going, la, and some of those la-las go straight to some of those fertile kids. And sometimes your la-la goes to some kid who, when I was teaching at UCSD, it was amazing because it was a real science school, and there were so many computer geeks, and they would take this giant poetry lecture that I taught just because it was like an easy, crazy grade, and it's sort of like a lot of those kids sitting in the rooms. But the thing is, one of those kids would get, it's like what William Burroughs said, language is a virus. One of those kids would get helplessly infected, and it would ruin their life, or turn them into the next amazing person with a very wonderful writing career. And they would be like, come into your office saying, my family, they just don't, I can't even tell them that I want to change my major, and so on. And so I think the thing is, you're really in this kind of beautiful, helpless, chaotic situation teaching writing, and I think that's, and if you'd like to talk, of course, you'll just do it and the connection will occur.
Other questions? Because I could go on and on.
I know this is being recorded, but did you like Helen Martin's paintings?
Ooh, yeah. You know, I did. I thought they were kind of scratchy and punk and uncomfortable, but yeah, I did. I mean, I think, I don't know if I would have, if I was in a room full of hundreds of paintings and those were the ones, would I have stopped at those ones? I don't know. You know, I was alone in the room with them, but I thought they were kind of cool. And they were sort of kind of uncomfortable and a little hateful, and they had some of Helen in them, you know. I mean, what hell could be worse than being an artist's wife, I think. Hi.
As a poet and a novelist, how did you choose poetry to be your main concern in life rather than writing? Or is it?
I didn't. I don't. Yeah. I mean, I just take turns. You know, it's sort of like if you have a poetry habit, you just, you know, like, I mean, there's always kind of a danger that you will. You know, I love writing poems, and so I can go a period of time and not write a poem and think, fuck, what if I'm not a poet anymore? You know, and then it's almost that very thought weirdly fertilizes the, you know, too busy, too something, you know, creates the next poem. But they're just very different jobs. You know, like in college, I wrote both stories and poems, and much preferred the idea of being a novelist because I knew who novelists were and I knew what novelists got, and it just seemed like a much better path, you know. And but you know, but for me, because I had this short attention span of my particular youth and my own particular case of ADD, poetry was sort of perfect for the life that I had in my 20s. And it wasn't until I hit my 30s that I could start to write long swatches of prose. And it wasn't until I became an art writer and worked with editors that I started to understand how editing worked, because I hadn't learned that in college. I would write these kind of explosive, excited term papers that sort of sympathetic professors would think, well, I enjoy your mind, you know, but they were like sort of unreadable, you know. And so, but editors in art magazines actually taught me how to make sentences, which I still find very difficult. So that eventually those skills led to, wrote a story, you know, wrote another story next year, you know, so coming to writing, and once I filled a whole book and wrote one whole collection of stories, I thought, now I can write a novel. So it was actually a very slow process for me, and poetry was there all the time in between. You know. Hi.
Have you ever written poetry about doubt?
About doubt?
About this idea of, can I do it? Or is that just
No, I think I write with it quite a, yeah, I think it's implicit. I think it's built in. But often I think it's sort of like, maybe because I'm such a Catholic, an ex-Catholic, it's sort of like I'm so full of doubt and so full of fear that I'm always ready to smash it like a fly when I can. And so often the poem just kind of comes down like a sledgehammer, like I'm going to move really, I mean, I do often do things really fast because I'm afraid if I stop, I won't do them. And so I kind of, doubt gets kind of obliterated quickly and then returns happily, you know. Hi.
So could you talk a little bit more about the resistance that you talked about doing art writing and sort of that transformation then between resistance, because I'm sure it wasn't like all of a sudden now I'm going to write about art and I'm completely comfortable with that.
Right.
Well,
Part of the discomfort was being secondary. You know, it's sort of like I grew up painting and drawing and was quite good and didn't actually happen to take that path. So for a long time in my life in New York, I both loved to look at art and it made me feel sorrowful because I would look at art and all I could see was what I wasn't doing, you know? And so and it wasn't until, I don't know, it was very accidental for me because I then was the director of St. Mark's Poetry Project for a while, and we had a fundraising project, which was an art auction. And this whole other world of people came into the building. And I just thought, wow, it felt different. It literally felt different. And also, I guess because I was involved in the commerce of art, which I think that I found that aspect of art intimidating, you know, and I didn't know how to fit myself into that logic. And so I kind of liked the feeling of it. And then I think, I had the opportunity, it's sort of like, because I was, and like I met Peter Sheldall when he was a former poet, and I met him when I was in my 20s. And he was always taking me to bars and introducing me to famous artists and editors and saying, this is Eileen, for 5 minutes, because he was very much that kind of person where like, here's the new great person. And I was the new great person for a while with Peter, but so he introduced me to all these people, and they were like relationships I had no use for because I wasn't in that economy. And so I think somebody just, had a show, and Rene Ricard, I don't know if this is sort of a former Warhol actor and art critic and now an art maker, and he was in a very, like full of ideas person, and he was like, Eileen, I'm doing a performance at the Guggenheim. You should write about it for Art America, and it was just like, really? Do you think I can do that? But Renee thought I could do that, and so somehow because of that I did it, and so I had done my first little piece, and then after this ecstatic experience with all the art people, it started to, and also I stopped drinking and taking drugs. I'm going to divulge endlessly. It was like I became somebody different. But, and when I became that different person, I started to have this sensation of going into an art gallery and thinking, oh my, this is just such a great feeling to look at art. And the sorrow sort of went away, and I found myself looking at art as opposed to wishing I had made the painting. And then suddenly writing became a way that I could have a relationship with this. And I have to say, there's something really sexy about, it's so pathetic, but going into a gallery where you look like sort of a, whatever, a person who's not going to buy anything, so that everybody who's dressed better than you in the gallery is like, and you walk in and you sort of like, plunk around looking at the art, and then you step up to the desk and say, I'm from Art Forum, can I get some slides? And then everybody goes, whoa, and you just feel so cool. And then it becomes also a thing about your taste, because it's sort of like then you see 20 shows in New York, and then you pitch, then you say, I want to write about blah, 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 blah. So you feel like you're shopping. You feel like you're picking art out of the, of the sea of art and making choices. And so there's a kind of a weird, so it was a very American sense of purchase in a world that hadn't felt like mine. But also just really the pleasure of, when I took workshops at St. Mark's Church, Alice Notley would drag in little bits of art and say, write a poem. And we're like, what? She was like, write a poem. Use that and write a poem. We're like, and it was just like, so there was already kind of an experience of taking an object and somehow, doing something with it. And so it's just another way to write a poem too, which is what the poet James Schuyler, who was also an art writer, he was just like, it's like when we write about art, we're just writing a poem, and then you got to put the kind of narrative thing in for the editors, and like make a story up so they'll feel that, the beautiful things that you've written have a point. So that there's all these games we play with ourselves. Also, I have a thing about sometimes if I could have the stupidest thought in the world, like I came into I was sent by a magazine to look at a show, and I walked in and I was like, fuck, look at this. No. But then suddenly I looked at it and there was all these trees, and I thought, wait a second, I love trees, though. I mean, I really do love trees immensely. And I thought, what if I started the review with the sentence, I love trees? How can I possibly do this in an art magazine? So the only reason I wrote that review was so I could get that line in a and that was fun, too. So there's a perverse exchange, too, going on, which is a secret fuck you in every art piece, which there might be.
One last question.
Yeah.
I was just wondering, as a poet, how does being a poet and approaching art criticism and art writing differ from, say, a philosopher, or art historian or another artist, if there is a difference, or if it's just different shades of the same sort of thing?
It's hard. Again, it's hard to say, because there are poets and art historians, but I feel like that part of what, to quote Frank O'Hara, poets tend to run on their nerve a little bit, so it's sort of like a lot of the energy of poetry is about inflating and deflating, or at least that's how I experience it. So you got a lot of gas to use, in relationship, and I think art historians are moving different pillars around the room. And also, my joke about art writing is always that we all have this secret little tattoo on our shoulder, we poets, born to describe, And when I was occasionally, I would be called on the carpet by an editor when I would just write such crazy reviews. They were like, Eileen, get it together. And I remember this is Betsy Baker, who was the great former editor of Art in America, and she goes, I just want to say, when in doubt, lean on the information. And I just looked at her like a dog. Lean, what does that mean? She goes, describe. So that idea that in inventory, and I think Susan Sontag said it very beautifully. She was talking about some paintings once that she really loved. There were these little Dutch miniatures of interiors of churches, and she talked about these paintings whose purpose was inventory, not art. And I thought that's so interesting, and I'm still thinking about that thought, you know, like the difference between inventory and art. And I think writing about art, especially as a poet, you're shuttling with that skill and doing something different with it. Because I think within a poem, you just simply explode in your own way. And I think in art writing, you're kind of managing your explosion to another, you know, to another end. And that's an interesting kind of control to gain, you know. Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about like your sharpness as a writer, and if you've experienced times where you've been less sharp, and how you get back to sharp?
Oh, that's such a funny question. I mean, I know exactly what you're talking about. I think you just keep writing through the dullness. I think you just have to. And sometimes it's good to do something else, either writing in a different genre than the one that you feel like you're not sharp in, or, you know, draw, or, you know, go. I have to say, running always helps my writing too. I really, like, if I'm seriously working on something that I have to keep working on and I have to sustain or construct some sharpness, I use breathing and exercise, you know, because it's sort of like, because we are animals after all, and I think that's part of the problem with writing, is the animal wants to go outside, and then there you are chained to this desk, you know, and it's horrible. So I think do something else. But I do always, one of the things I always think about writing that's so funny is that it feeling shitty doesn't mean that it is shitty. You know, sometimes I'll write something and I'll like, that is amazing. And I'll think, I have written such an amazing page, paragraph, poem. I'm like, oh my God, you know. And then I look at it the next day and it's completely crazy. And it is not good at all and has no value. And other times I'm writing pages and pages of stuff and I just feel like I'm just like swimming through some mucusy substance that is not pleasant. And it's just, and for whatever reason I don't stop. And I look at it later and it was something really good was happening. And so I think the unpleasant feeling or the unsharpness is not always a bad thing. You know, blunt is good too. There we go.
Sometimes the blunt is good too.
Yeah.
So you just end there. I just want to thank you very much for being here, and thank you all for coming. And we'll see you at our next programs and events, and drive safely and all that kind of stuff you say at the end of things. Thank you. Beautiful.